Hey, folks, welcome to Christians in Crypto. My name is Matt, and I'm really curious. Are you somebody that is struggling? Are you somebody that's struggling with depression or anxiety? Certainly, I'm no stranger to those topics. But one of the things that I've struggled with, and I think many people have struggled with, is this: what's this thing all about? What's the purpose? Is there a plan? Is this all by accident? I think what's incredible is we're seeing within our culture across the world that things that were done in secret or in hiding or in darkness are being revealed. And you don't have to look too far to see so many things that are being uncovered and so many things that are changing. And it's hard to make sense of those things. And so the intent of today is to really talk about what I've discovered. Um, and I think many people have discovered. And this idea of what is the meaning and the purpose of life. I mean, I think it's something that everyone is, challenged with. And of course, as you talk to folks that are older, you come to recognize some commonalities and some things that are interesting. But I want to share with you my perspective for whatever it's worth. And I've been praying prior to this stream that there would be someone who this would be encouraging to, and that there would be some benefit. And so that's the whole point this morning. Just inspired to share some thoughts with you and really examine this big story. If you look at the Bible, you see that there is a beginning, and that beginning is in a garden. And of course, what do you think of when you think of a garden? You think of, I think, a small place, right? A garden is somewhere where there's, provision and things growing, but it seems like it's a relatively small place in the term itself. So that's really in Genesis 1:1, this idea that there's this beginning, and it's, obviously the heavens and the earth, but there's this Garden of Eden. And what it looks like to me is a place of rest, a place of protection. And if you fast forward to all the way to the end, to the last chapter of Revelation, right? The 66 books of the Bible, it ends in a city, in a kingdom that will never pass away. So if we look at this from that perspective, this overarching, directional, progressive, growing thing, which starts in a garden and finishes in a city. And that city is a part of a kingdom that never passes away. From beginning to end, we have the stories of man and woman struggling to understand what is the meaning and the purpose of this life. And so, what I want to talk to you about today is the hope, the encouragement of this one core premise. And it's really the short, pithy statement that has really transformed my life in the last several years. And that's this idea that Jesus is alive and he speaks. And so we're going to break down a lot today about what this means. And I hope this is an encouragement to you. So let's start at the very beginning. We know this story of Adam and Eve. We know that they're in this garden and they only know good. And right, there's some direction within this garden that you should not eat from this tree. Hey, you can, there's provision everywhere, but you can't eat from this tree. And this tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so there's something that you don't know about. You only know good. Well, one of the big mysteries or challenges or teachings that are within the church is this idea that um, Adam and Eve made a decision, and that decision threw a monkey wrench into the cogs of God's plan. People often call it the fall. And I've come to understand it very differently. And I think this is really important because this is the basis and the standard for which many, Christian teaching is based upon, is this idea that Adam and Eve they messed things up. And if you actually dig into this, there's a gentleman by the name of Heiser who is a Hebrew scholar who goes into detail in this terminology, looking at the Hebrew, this very beginning of what it looks like when you read it. If you get into the Hebrew, it says, in the beginning, the Elohim created. And not to get into the weeds too much around this idea of the Elohim, but what was God's intent? I can't imagine that, God doesn't know all things, because if man and woman could throw a monkey wrench into the plan, what kind of God is he? Right? We talk about this God of all power and, omniscient, all knowing. And if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense that, oh, yeah, you messed things up. Well, if you're the God of all creation, you know all things, why would this creation of yours be able to mess up your plan? So I back up and I look at a garden to a city in this progress of growth that happens in this lifetime and all these stories in between these 66 books. And what do we see? We see a story emerge that is one that is with God. And it's a constant battle between this concept of knowing good and evil. And so I'm going to suggest to you that this was all a part of God's plan from the very beginning. That in the garden itself, the intent was that you would be like the gods, meaning you would be Elohim, you would be like God, knowing good and evil. That the intent all along was that you would rule with him in the fullness of his nature and character. And this idea that we've been presented the fact that, oh, yeah, you guys messed this thing up. You really just shot his wheels off in the plan. You messed up the plan. Well, what's interesting is it says that the serpent, right, was the craftiest of all, meaning a very smart and wise creature that the Lord God had created. So oftentimes we personify this as Satan himself. But if you actually look at the text, what it's saying is that Satan himself actually comes into this serpent. And you think about it, what was it like prior to Eve talking with the serpent? Adam named the animals. And if you imagine this, well, how would a serpent be smart? Well, clearly there's a time likely when this creature spoke and they understood that this was the wisest, right? This is the smartest guy out there. Well, what happens is Satan uses this wise, trusted serpent as a mechanism to make an offer to Eve. And this is really interesting story because in what we see in the Bible in the beginning is this idea that there's a lie that's told. And Satan, through the serpent, makes this offer and says, hey, certainly God did not say that you can't eat of this. Your eyes will be open. You will know, good and evil. You will be like God. And think about this for a second. That's a lie. They were like God already. He created them in his image. They didn't have this knowledge of evil. They didn't even understand what death was. So imagine the term death. If you didn't see any death anywhere, you're in this garden, this, idyllic place. You only know good. So if somebody says to you, surely you won't die, you have zero context for what the concept of death is. Think about that. I think that's absolutely incredible. It's like a random word that you've never heard before. You don't know death. It has not entered. You don't have any context for it. Now, when we look back at that, we understand what death is. But if you're, Adam and Eve in the garden, and there's this crafty guy that you've trusted in the past, the serpent, and Satan has entered through him. Well, we present this as if this is a surprise. That this is a surprise that Satan himself came in. Well, let's back out for a second and ask this question. Who created the angels who fell? Who created the Elohim? Who created the angelic realm? You think God's not aware of those angels that are making decisions, those Elohim or those Satan himself? No, he's aware of this. So if you back out and you go, this God of all creation that is omniscient, omnipresent, is got all knowledge, must have a plan. And if he created you and me in his image, well, maybe there was a purpose for you understanding the difference between good and evil. I think what's really amazing about this story of what commonly is called the fall of man is been presented as you screwed up. We just screwed this thing up. Well, if that's the case, then then who is God? If he can be fooled, if he can be tricked. So I'm going to offer you a different perspective. What if actually this is the plan all along? And if you follow the scriptures through, you realize that, hold on, we were made in the image of God. And if you think about who Jesus is, right? He's compared to Melchizedek, the high priest. This would be, God's son, a special son. This is the one that all things are created for him and by him. And so imagine this council, if you will, of Elohim, including Jesus, right? A lot of times we present this as the Trinity. It's the only thing that's there at the beginning is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, it makes it really clear that Elohim is a plural word. And if you look at Heiser's teaching in this and the analysis of the actual words in the Hebrew, it looks to be as if there is a divine council and that there are more than one of these Elohim. He created these beings. And there are a number of different beings of different classes. There's obviously this Elohim class, which is a rulership class. There is the angelic class, which is the messenger class. And then there are the animal class, which is the servant class. And what's amazing is right from the beginning there, things got turned upside down by Satan, coming through an animal to speak to a woman who then gave to the man. And this upside down approach was basically to say, hey, this guy who you've been paying attention to, right? You've been following God. You have been, walking with him in the garden. You can't trust him. So think about this for a second. What did Eve actually do? Eve went her own way. She was convinced by Satan through this serpent that, well, maybe this God isn't to be trusted. Maybe this isn't, he said not to eat of this tree. But here's this guy that we've talked to in the past who's pretty trustworthy, and he's saying, no, certainly he didn't say that. You won't certainly die. So what's really interesting about that concept, and this is what this whole stream is about, is the fact that we have the ability to ask God. So what did Eve do? She essentially gave her authority as Elohim, right? We were created in this image of God, did not understand what death was, didn't understand what this knowledge of evil was. But rather than stopping and pausing and stepping back and going, you know what? Let me consult the creator of all things. She decided to do it on her own. And I think that there in that, if you think about sin, right? Original sin, this idea of, you know what? I can make my own decisions and I can go my own way. It would have been very easy for Eve, I'm sure, and probably had many situations in which they would ask, right? Walking with God in the cool of the day, hey, what do you think about this? How do you see it? How should we understand this? And clearly there was direction given that's documented in the scriptures that, hey, you can eat from all of these, but you can't eat from that. Well, where's that come from? That clearly comes from God himself, right? Hey, here's the lay of the land. Here's what we've got. Well, it's not a surprise. And I'm going to make the case that it's not a surprise to God. It was his intent all along that you would understand good and evil. Why? Because to really truly be like him, you have to make choices. And so I'm going to suggest to you that the purpose of all creation was that God created man in the fullness of his nature and character, that they would rule over this place, the earth, given dominion and authority over it with him. But what is this first experience that we see where things change? It's when Eve goes, you know what? I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to make a decision apart from consulting God. They clearly had access to him. And what does she do? Well, surely he didn't say that, right? So she takes and she eats, and her eyes are open. And then she gives to Adam. And what do we find out? They realize they're naked. This understanding of a new way of seeing things that came from giving her authority over to Satan. And at that point in time, this intent, or this created being in the nature and the character and in the image of God has essentially subordinated her authority and Adam's authority to Satan. And what ends up happening? They realize they're naked, and what do they cover? I think it's really fascinating that we cover the things in our lives that are different. I had a friend ask me, he said, so these fig leaves, did they cover their elbows, or was it their knees? Did they cover their feet, or did they cover their heads? And so imagine a naked woman and a naked man standing across from each other, looking at each other. What did they cover? They didn't cover their eyes, they didn't cover their ears, they didn't cover their hands. They covered that which was different about them. They were naked and ashamed. So think about this for a second. Prior to this giving of authority over to Satan, right? And their eyes being open and understanding good and evil is really the functional ability to make a choice. And they have this ability to make this choice, but now they see things differently. And what are they? They're ashamed because there are things that are different about them. Well, in life, those that are dealing with all kinds of difficulties and everything, things usually go one of two ways. We either are covering and puffing up and exaggerating about something about us because we feel insecure, right? So there's something different about us. And so we say, look at me. I might socially signal with my fancy watch, but I am presenting to you a story that is not accurate, but it's one in which makes me feel it's a cover. I'm not exposed. You see this thing and you have an impression of me. Okay, so that's really this idea of pride or a puffing up, if you will, presenting a story that's not accurate. Right? So if we think about this concept of covering that which is different about us, what do we end up doing? We present a story. We present something that is inaccurate or what we hope people would see in us because we're ashamed of who we are. And it's really interesting to me that in this context, Adam and Eve found themselves covering that which was different about them. And they felt ashamed, embarrassed. And so they hide and they cover. And so we either puff it up or we conceal. And so these are these two concepts that happen. And so what ends up happening is we feel insecure. And so we respond in ways in which is hiding things. And what I would submit to you is that prior to this event where their eyes were open and they understood good and evil, which I believe is the very plan, because in order for you to do the work that God had created, he created this whole place so that you and I would rule and reign this place, right? We would have dominion over it with him in his nature and character. And so what ends up happening is they get kicked out of the garden. And they're kicked out of the garden, and there's flaming, flashing swords. Why would there be weapons on fire keeping them from coming back in? And what's really surprising to me is, was it a surprise to God himself that Satan had come into the serpent? Or was that the plan all along? Because if you think about this concept of doing things with God, there's a litany and an example in Jesus himself, as we will discuss, that mirrors this. And so what I'm going to make a case for, that's the basis for this idea that we have authority. God has given us authority, and we continually give that away to Satan. And what's amazing is, what does God want? Well, fast forward, and what do we see? We see God's Son, Jesus himself, come into the world, and what does he model? What behavior does he model? He models the way for us. He even said, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. Okay, so if we're trying to find meaning and purpose in life, well, who's the guy who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life? So let's take a look at what this way, truth, and life is. Well, if we want to align ourselves with the very nature and character of God in creation, we have to understand his nature and character. Well, that is most personified in his son. And what's amazing about this context is leading up to Jesus, the Old Testament itself, from my perspective, is one in which we are defining who we are in relationship with God. Moses goes up on a mountain. What does he get? He gets a picture of the throne room of God. He's actually told how to build the tabernacle, which is essentially an analog to the throne room. This idea that there is a veil, right? So the Ark of the Covenant, right, is this place where God dwells, right? His presence, and then there's a veil. There's a separator between God and man. And this is set up, and there are offerings that are brought, all of that stuff. And of course, the law, which was given in the Ten Commandments. What's amazing about this is it defines where we sit. Here we are on this in this world, and there's given provision for the ability to access God Himself. And why would there be a separator? We see that when Moses goes up in the mountain, that God is seen as a consuming fire. Well, this idea of holiness, pureness, what is fire? Well, that is refinement. This idea that heat is literally that burns away all things, it exposes all things. So all of these edifices that we build up to either puff up in pride or to cover are burned away, because that is this pureness of holiness. And so there's this picture, there's this analog of what the relationship between God and man is all the way through the Old Testament. The organizational structures, the building of the temple, the processes, the rules, all of these things. But there's this constant need to keep coming back to atone for what is started in the garden. And this is the idea that we have gone our own way. And what is amazing to me is Jesus comes on the scene. And here is Jesus, who in many, many cases, he goes into the wilderness, he comes out, and Satan is there. Okay. This is the same Satan in the garden. And what does he do? What does he promise to Jesus? And what does Jesus say? Well, one of the specific stories is he says, turn these stones into bread. And what does Jesus reply? Man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Okay, so let's stop for a second. Prior to this giving of authority over to Satan, Adam and Eve walked with God, right? They were with him. And what's amazing is becoming like him is the ability to choose him or not choose him. Cain and Abel. There's so much evidence in the scriptures that God spoke to Cain and Abel. There was this literal interfacing, and at that time clearly could speak to God. And I think we get the impression within the church that, well, they were shut off and cut out. Well, no, there's direct evidence that God spoke to Cain and Abel. And when they brought their, when they brought their offerings to God, one was accepted and one wasn't. And what's amazing to me is Cain slays his younger brother. Did God stop that? No, he didn't. He honored the choices because that's what the intent was. If you're going to be like me, you have to know the difference between good and evil and choose. And so the whole point of this stream, what is the meaning and purpose of life? Well, there's a structure, there's a framework, there's a creation, and you can align yourself with it. But if you see this thread that goes all the way through the Bible from the point of the garden all the way through to the city, into a kingdom that never ends. What do we see? Well, Jesus comes onto the scene and he's very, very different. And there's many examples of, I just named one, Jesus saying, "Nope, man does not live on bread alone." Okay, so he's telling you how man lives. Man lives out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Isn't that interesting? So if you want to say, well, how does man live? Well, Jesus said, you don't live on bread alone. The bread is a function, but there is more to this. It's literally out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. So it's really interesting that my experience within the church is that that essentially God is dead. That Jesus is a historical figure. But what did Jesus model when he was here? He spoke with the Father. We call it praying. But when you dive into the Greek and you look at what Jesus was doing with his Father, he was talking with him. Let's not make it more. This wasn't incantations. This wasn't spells. This was a conversation because he spoke with the Father. Man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Oh, okay. So I guess you can talk with him. Jesus did. What's amazing to me is that there are many examples of this where specifically people heard, and it was documented, that the voice came out of the heavens. And so I want to share with you those because I want to make this case that the function of life, this whole purpose and construct, is that we have this ability to choose whether to do things with God or on our own, to either go it alone or consult him. And the assumption that you would have if you consulted him was that he has a plan. So let's think about this. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is right before he's going to the cross. And he knows what's going to happen. And in fact, he is literally sweating blood. And he says to his Father, he talks to his Father. And we think prayer is something like, oh, I got to do it like on this, bowing down this way, fold my hands, close my eyes, whatever it may be. No, what is prayer? But the exchanging of wishes, this discussion, this conversation. And so it says that Jesus went a stone's throw away and he talked with his Father. And what did his Father say? I don't know. It's not documented in the Bible. But it says that Jesus was changed. And he conferred, he talked with his Father. And what did they talk about? Well, the request was, hey, remove this cup from me. Meaning this is a pretty sour, bitter thing to take. And I'm just speculating that what was said there was, hey, remember what we planned from the very beginning. How are we going to fulfill this plan if you don't go the distance? And think about that for a second in every challenge that you face. This is one that we hold up and we're like, wow, this is like Jesus going and going, hey, is there any way we can do this that's different? And I think what's amazing about that is think about anything that you're challenged with: anxiety, worry, depression, sickness, relationship issues, whatever it may be. These are challenges. And was that, are your challenges that you're going to the cross to be crucified? No. So it's probably somewhere below, death on a cross. But what Jesus is modeling here when he says man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word, is that this God, this living God, is accessible. But what does Jesus accomplish? Because he does go to that cross. And what ends up happening? That thing that Moses was told about on the mountain ultimately became a temple. It started out as a tent and a tabernacle, but the very form and function of it was reproduced in these solid forms of a temple. And for a long, long time, people came and they atoned for man's sin. Yep, we've gone our own way. We've got to say we're sorry. What is the way in which we get back in your good graces? Right? This idea of the Passover. right? This annual time where they tied a rope around the high priest in case if he died, they could pull him out because you couldn't go in there but once a year. And what does it say? When Jesus died, a voice came from the heavens. God spoke, and he did this many times. And many times that you heard the voice of God from the sky was speaking to who Jesus is and who he. And what's amazing about that to me is that everything changed because the veil that separated this holy God, this consuming fire from man, was torn from the top down. That's incredible. The separator, the veil. And what's amazing is through Jesus himself, he is essentially the one that reconciles us to God himself. But what it means more than what I feel the church is saying is that's about salvation and you going to heaven. No, 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 no. You're getting way ahead of yourselves. What does it mean? Well, there was a woman who was she made some pretty bad decisions. The woman at the well. She came during the heat of the day because she didn't want to be scorned by other people. And Jesus is there. And he asks her, "Hey, woman, give me something to drink." And she's like, "Man, we're Samaritans and we don't talk with you Jews or you don't talk with us." And what's amazing is she says, "You worship up on that mountain." And what does Jesus say to her? Besides knowing everything she ever did, he said, "There's coming a time when you will worship in spirit and in truth." And who's he speaking to? He's speaking to a Samaritan woman. This is a Gentile. This is not a Jew. This is not a Hebrew. There's a time coming when you will worship in spirit and in truth. And so Jesus's death and resurrection represents this enormous turning point. I mean, we take our date of time and we separate it based on Jesus's birth. When you think about this concept that starts in a garden, that basically is this juxtaposition of doing things with God according to his plan or doing things on our own. We see this time and time and time and time again of these examples of, are you going to do it my way or are you going to do it your way? But being like me means you have the choice to do it your way. So when I thought about this dream and was praying and studying, what is the meaning and the purpose of life? What's the whole point? How does this all fit together? Well, there's so much examples of this idea of in John 10:10 of to have life and have it to its full. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a full life? So much of our culture that is upside down is telling you that you are an accident, that over billions and billions of years, you evolved into this. And what's amazing is that's pretty I was listening to Tucker Carlson. This is a Western idea. This is actually a very modern idea. If you look into history, this was not the prevailing thought of science and reason and, we got it figured out and we're just the descendant of an amoeba, right? That just, things bumped into each other and you evolved into this. Because the story that the Bible says is you were created in the image of God and you were being conformed to his likeness. Well, how did we become conformed to his likeness? If without me you can do nothing, John 15:5, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you can do nothing, nothing. Well, what does it mean? Well, I can do something, right? I can go get lunch. No, no, no. You can't do anything that has eternal value without being connected to him. And it's amazing when you start looking at the scripture and you start seeing what Jesus said. It's basically like very simple. What did he say to the disciples when he was recruiting these guys? Follow me. Peter, James, and John go up to the Mount of Transfiguration and they see Jesus transfigured. Literally, his face changes. He becomes this glowing person. And what do they see? They're seeing Jesus, and there is Moses and Elijah. And who are Moses and Elijah? Well, number one, they recognize who Moses and Elijah were. How did they know it was them? That's number one. Number two, It says in all of the gospels, at least the synoptic gospels, it says that he was talking to them. So here's Jesus in his, glorified state, transfigured. He's talking. No, he wasn't doing some crazy thing, sitting on some sort of throne. No, he was talking to Moses and Elijah. Well, there's a couple things I take from that. Number one is, what were they talking about? And two, that means that Moses and Elijah are alive. Can't talk to somebody who's dead. And it's very clear that God is the God of the living. So our understanding of death must also be wrong. But this idea that presented to Peter, James, and John, the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah represent their everything that they had built everything upon. And here is this Jesus talking to, and what ends up happening there. And this is one of the most significant things that happen. They want to build like equal tents, like they want to build these coverings. And what do we do? What do we do? This is great that we're here. What do we do? And a voice comes from the sky and it says, "This is my son. Listen to him." When I was a kid, I think I remember my parents basically saying, "How many times do I have to tell you?" I don't know if your parents ever said that to you. My parents said, "How many times do I have to tell you before you get it through your thick skull? How many times do I have to tell you?" Well, one of the beauties of the scriptures is it's told over and over and over and over again. What's amazing is if you think about, hey, would life be better if I align myself with the very, framework of creation of how it's set up to function? Hey, what if we tried that out for size? Well, what does it say? Does it say that you need to read a book? No, it says that God is near. And ultimately, if you think about this, there's coming a day when you will worship in spirit and in truth. You don't have to go to this building. He tore this veil from the top down. You have access to him. And it says, "No one comes to the Father except through me." Well, what we think of that is a passageway. And it's been compared that way, right? A narrow gate. Look at the rich young ruler. He's like, "Hey, I followed all the rules. I'm really good at following all of these, Hebrew rules." What does Jesus say to him? "Hey, go sell everything and follow me." And of course, he gets choked up. I can't do that. So think about this idea that where does true life come from? It comes from us aligning ourselves with the plan and the trajectory of this story. We are a part of this story, and God designed us to be like him, having the ability to choose. But if the gate is narrow, right, and it's wide that leads to destruction, then this life, which is very short, my father always said to me, "Hey, man, it just goes by so fast." I'm like, "Whatever, old man." And now I'm an old man, and I realize he's right. So this is a very short time, and in many cases, people previously lived longer, right? Lived upwards of 1,000 years. Many of us don't think of this shortening of the lifespan as being the grace of God, but it is. It's a reward. But what he's saying to us over and over again is, in order for you to be with me, you have to make a choice. When Jesus is on the cross, there's two criminals on his left and on his right. One is, cursing him, and the other goes, "Surely you are who you say you are." He basically is saying, "Hey, I recognize you as God's son, the Messiah." And what does Jesus say to him? He's nailed up on a cross next to him. What was that criminal? Why was he there? Likely because he made some pretty bad choices. And that literally they believed that the penalty was death for him. But that story is so significant because Jesus says to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Well, if this gate is narrow, what is the functionality that gets you through that gate? This criminal who's done all these bad things, and you may be in that situation where you're like, "Man, I've done a lot of really bad things." Or maybe not. It wasn't measured based upon the aggregation of all of these terrible things that this criminal had done. It was this choice to recognize who he is and align yourself with the very, framework. The framework is Jesus is the Son of the living God. All things were made for him and by him. So who would you rather go to? I would want to go to the author and perfecter of this whole thing. I would like to go to the architect. I would like to go to the boss. And it's very, very clear that the God of all creation, Jehovah himself, gave this authority to Jesus. Can't get to the Father except through him. And the gate, it's narrow. Why? Why is it narrow? Well, there's a parable in Mark. You probably remember hearing something about this. There was such a great multitude of people that Jesus had to get into a boat and push himself back from the shore. And he told an agricultural story. And the story was about seed that fell onto different paths and what ended up happening. And what's amazing is there's a group of guys, after that story was over and all the people went home, there was a group of people who came to Jesus and said, "What did you mean by that story?" And in that is the picture, in my opinion, of the true meaning and purpose of life. Jesus is alive and he speaks. Are you interested in understanding what he means and how he sees this whole thing? And what I've discovered in my life, I went my own way and I still go my own way. And I'm realizing that this is literally a moment by moment decisions that we make. But for 28 years of my life, I was like, hey, I got this thing handled. I got this thing figured out. I got this tiger by the tail. I'm going to grab this bull by the horns. And then you come into crisis and you come into just utter destruction and you realize, man, I don't have much strength. So I look back and I say, well, how did you make this thing? What is the framework of it? What is the plan that you had? Ah, how do you see this? So the whole purpose, this idea of having life and having life to its fullness, a peace that transcends all understanding, comes from recognizing that God is accessible through Jesus, that he's alive and he speaks. And many times, frustrating to me, is that, I've been, going to Bible church for a long time. And Jesus is presented as a historic figure. Yeah, he was a good guy. He did some great things. But it's only on Easter Sunday, and I'm not saying only, but a lot of times it's just on Easter Sunday we say he is risen. What is amazing about this whole Christian thing, this whole, what people would define as a religion, which in my opinion, it's not a religion at all. What's amazing about this is this event, this Jesus himself, who literally is, he's God incarnate. And he's saying, I'm going to change the nature of this game. You don't need to go to this building once a year and pay for these things. You can come to me. You can follow me moment by moment. You can hold every thought captive. If you run into challenges, consider it pure joy when facing troubles of many kinds. You can ask me. I met a man named Steve Staggs, professional baseball player in the 1970s. He's passed. And Steve was amazing. And he practiced this his life. And these are the things that Jesus told him. He's like, hey, how do you see this? And probably the number one thing that Steve did in his life was disciplined to stop, to step back, and to ask Jesus, how do you see this? And if you think about it, Jesus modeled the same thing. He said, man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. He said, I only do what I see the Father doing. He literally prays and talks with God and says, hey, if there's any other way, remove this cup from me. No, conferring with, doing things not separately, but with God himself, not giving his authority away to Satan and to the spirits who are trying to get your authority. Because it talks about sin crouching at the door. If the devil was so powerful, he would have destroyed you already. Why and what holds this back? Well, you could make a case for a number of things. But one of these things is it really requires your authority. You give this authority away. I think a really good example of this is, let's say you own a home and you own the home outright and it's worth a half $500,000. Awesome, great house. And a man walks up to your door and he's got a suitcase with $1 million cash and says, I would like to buy your house for $1 million. Does that person own your house? Nope. Can't make any decisions about it. Why? Because it's an offer. So, what has to happen in order for that person to own your house? You have to give it your approval. You have to give it your authority because you are the owner. There's a story of the prodigal son, and that son goes to his father and says, I want my inheritance now. Give it to me now. I want it now. And what does the father do? He says, okay, you can have it. And this father, in his wisdom, finances his son's debauchery. He literally goes out and spends it all, prostitutes and probably gambling and all these things, makes these decisions. What is he doing? He's going his own way. He's like, old man, I got this figured out. Give me my money. And what ends up happening is he squanders all this wealth and he finds himself literally eating with the pigs. And he recalls, oh, in my father's house, there are even servants, right? Slaves who eat better than I'm eating. I wonder if I went back to my father, if he would give me a place as his slave. And what's amazing is the son forgot who he was. He was a son. And so as he approaches, the father runs out and he says, this is my son. He was dead and now he is alive. He puts this robe on him. He kisses his neck. He gives him a ring of authority. Well, what happened there? The younger son who comes back understands the nature and character of his father. This is the story of the entire shooting match in one. But Jesus, in his infinite, brilliant communication, reminded us so many times of the same thing. Do you not know what your father has stored up for you? Do you understand the nature and character of your father? And it's amazing when you think about this, like anything is possible. The mustard seed is compared to the faith that moves mountains. It doesn't move mountains because you will it to move mountains. It moves mountains in accordance with his plan. And just like Jesus, when he was like, here, remove this cup to me. No, not my will, but your will be done. Understanding the nature and character, the strategic nature of the plan of God from the very beginning in the garden to this kingdom that never passes away, in this city, this trajectory and growth, that there's a plan and a purpose to all of this stuff. And when we come in alignment with its very created nature and character, there's life and it's abundant. And what's amazing about it is the son recognizes his father's nature and character. And when they understand the father's nature and character, he's restored. I'm really fascinated by the ring that he's given. That ring that he is given is a ring that in those days was the signature of the family. It likely had the family's crest on it, right? It had the family's symbol. And that's where we get the term signature, a signet ring. The son goes his own way, does his stuff. And this is just us, right? We think we got it figured out. And this is the context of going your own way. This is the knowledge of good and evil. This is the ability to choose. Why did God not step in and say, don't kill your little brother, Cain? Because this is part of the framework of choosing. And when I look at life across the board and I say, what is the meaning of this? Well, the meaning of this is literally, it feels a lot like boot camp in preparation for the assembly of this army, this authority And it speaks of heaven. If those who do and are approved literally have responsibilities and roles to play in heaven over 5 or 10 cities. Interesting. So, in this process, I feel compelled to tell you that Jesus is alive and he speaks. No one gets to the Father except through him, that he is actually alive, and that you can hold every thought captive and ask him how he sees things. I've done it myself, and it is absolutely amazing that there is this supernatural interface when speaking to Jesus. The Bible is really helpful to understand and to see and to remind these things. But you know what the testament of the Bible is to what Jesus said? Jesus is ready to go back up to heaven, right? He's like, I got to leave you guys. I'm getting out of here. And they're like, whoa, you got to go? He goes, hang on. If I don't go, the Spirit won't come. Well, who is the Spirit? The Holy Spirit, the counselor. And he says, when Jesus describes who the Spirit is, which is, in my opinion, the greatest decentralization event that ever happened, is that Jesus himself, the Spirit of God, would dwell within you and would remind you of everything I said. Interesting. Man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. So what does it take? Does it take you got to go to a church on Sunday? No. The people that pursued Jesus and said, hey, what did you mean by that agricultural story when he was talking about the seeds in the path? He called them the ecclesia. And what does ecclesia mean? The called out ones. It's the term that we translate as church. If the gate is narrow, right? This pathway is narrow. No one gets to the Father except through Jesus, and it's narrow. It takes interest. You have to be interested. And I think about all the distractions. What is the plan of Satan? What is the plan of its distraction? It's the same lie that was given at the beginning. Surely you didn't say that. No, you're smarter than that. You're one of these Elohim. You're made in the image of this dude. You go your own way, man. You got control. You got the ability to do this stuff. And what ends up happening is we give over our authority to Satan. And what does he give us in return? But power. And so this whole system that we live in that's upside down is literally people exchanging their authority for the power and resources in this world. And what ends up happening is those resources get hoarded and lorded. And so what do we have? We've got this illusion of scarcity in the world, but the creation, the core creation is abundant. You take a kernel of corn, one seed of corn, you plant that in the ground, and you get 1,600 seeds from it on 2 ears of corn in 18 rows. What? Yeah, yeah. By the way, when you put that seed in the ground, you don't create the seed. 2, you don't create the ground. 3, you don't create the warmth. 4, you don't create the rain and the sunshine. But when you do that, when you partner and you take the time and you partner with God and you put that in the ground, what ends up happening? There's a yield. And that yield is like 1,600 to 1. Well, take that as an analogy to think of, well, I want to live in that kind of abundance. I'm not suggesting that's money. What I'm suggesting that is a peace that transcends all understanding. That is wisdom. That is direction. That's guidance. That's peace. Well, that's what people want. And what they don't realize is they're stuffing all kinds of other stuff, financial security, relationships, whatever it may be. They're making those things God. And what did like God say to Moses from the very beginning? Do not have any other gods before me. These are idols. So we're idolizing these things and we're putting them in the place in which God himself should be. And we go our own way and we're like, yeah, I need another Super Bowl ring. I need another $1 billion. I need more farmland and more control. And I need to be able to, censor and control you and fight and to kill. Why do I kill and I covet? Because I don't get what I want. We got to stop thinking, what do I want? And say, Jesus, what do you want? Jesus is alive. The whole thing rests on that concept of him being alive. But what's amazing about it is there's a lot of Christendom, there's a lot of teachers in this world that they don't realize what they're saying is, yeah, he was a good guy. We can learn from his example, but you're on your own, bro. And they don't mean it that way. But if you literally went to said somebody and said, you know what, I believe that Jesus is alive and he speaks, and that I literally go to him in prayer, in conversation, and I desire and have interest to be changed by him. And I only want to do what he guides and instructs me to do. That pastor will say to you, amen, brother, and slap you on the back. But when you start doing the things that Jesus asks you to do, it's highly disruptive to the function of this belief system. I'll praise you for it conceptually, but I will scorn you in its practice. Why? Because we have built the systems and belief systems so that they are controlling, right? The very structure and nature of it is sit down, shut up, and listen to me. I mean, this is just a continuation of this thing that is out, it's upside down. What is amazing to me is what is the purpose of kind of onboarding people, telling them about Jesus and helping them understand this discipleship and to understand these very things is so that you would be sent out. What did Jesus do? He visited with these guys for a period of time and then he sent them into the world. You don't just forever stay in college. Well, some people do. The point is that you're getting prepared for something. Well, what is the whole preparation? Why am I doing this stream? What is the meaning and purpose of life? To align yourself with the very nature and character and framework of this place and to do it with God in the fullness of his nature and character. Why? Because all of the things we come up against, the internet, a gun, a hammer, literally it's this tool, and that tool is neutral until you animate it with a certain nature and character. So I would ask the question, somebody who shoots up a school, what is the nature and character animating that gun? What is the nature and character of one that hunts with it to provide food? What is the nature and character of using a hammer to fix a house that provides a home for your family, or the hammer that beats someone over the head and kills them? It's not the hammer. It's the nature and character of the one that animates that hammer. But all of these tools that we have are neutral. And so many people are lying to you saying, well, the internet's evil. No, people are evil. The internet is neutral. And here we are getting to the point where we're talking about sentient AI. We're delving into very interesting places. Transhumanism, all kinds of things around identity. Well, why are those things being attacked? Because that's the way in which we confuse, and that's the way in which we distract, and that's the way in which we get your head buried into a phone. Because if you're consuming and listening and have your focus somewhere, your interest isn't in listening to a living and speaking Jesus. The coolest part about this is it's not a religious thing at all. You can be absolutely anyone and be interested. Hey, I'm interested. Teach me how to hear from you. Steve said to me, and I love this story. He said, when you brought your daughter home, so our first daughter brought her home from the hospital, she was so tiny. And I remember being in my Ford Expedition and I had this child seat, which looked huge. And she was this teeny little baby and it had to have like this pad around it to keep her locked in there. And I was like constantly looking in the rearview mirror going, are we really allowed to have this kid? It was just so foreign to me. I hadn't really cared. And it was like the most valuable thing my wife and I have ever created, this life in the back. And now she's graduated high school. And what's amazing about this is here is this baby, and there's so much, evidence that if a mother doesn't look into the baby's eyes, that you don't give affection and love and care and protection to this child. It has physical and, literally brain formation issues. And so there's a structure and a context to this relationship between our children and us. And it's modeled based on the framework of creation. But Steve said to me, he said, "Did your daughter speak English when she was born?" I kind of laughed. I'm like, duh, no. "Well, did you communicate with your daughter?" Well, yeah. Well, what was the communication? I remember when I was, we literally brought her home those first couple days. I couldn't believe how noisy babies were. We got this bassinet by the bed, and I'm like sleeping with one eye open because I can't believe that they let me have this child. And I literally, what does the baby do? One of the things we notice is that when the baby was hungry, that you started hearing these noises and kind of chewing on her hands. And no teeth or anything like that, but it was obvious, this grunting and all this. Well, that's communication. Is that English? No, it's not English. And then you think about the communication between the baby and the mother. And in this process of time, my daughter didn't speak English until she was, well, probably 2, 1.5, 2, started using terms. But it was very clear that there was communication going on. And so as I've met people who have practiced this, they've literally talked to Jesus. My grandmother said he's always been more than enough. When you see mature people, they recognize the fact that, Jesus isn't a slot machine you go to and go, "Hey, give me the lottery number so I can go get the money and go my own way." It's not how it works. The blessing from Jesus comes from walking with him moment by moment, not even daily, like literally holding every thought captive. And so if you're facing troubles of many kinds, of anxiety, of depression, of challenges, of decision making, of relationships, of whatever it may be, you have a choice to make. There are those that want you to destroy yourself. They can't destroy you, but they're going to give you all kinds of ways in which you can destroy yourself. But realize this, it's crouching at the door. It is not devouring you because you have the ability to choose. So when you're facing troubles of many kinds, you consider it pure joy. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can consider it pure joy because there is a plan. There is one that you can go to gain perspective, not my will, but your will. And what is the exchange for that? One, a packet of faith that helps you endure. Two, provides you with literally the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, self control. All of these things, goodness. What is the result of following Jesus moment by moment? Well, I've found miraculous things to happen. But the greatest of the currency of Jesus is peace that transcends all understanding. Paul talked about it whether in plenty or in want. Well, what does that represent? He was in jail. Interesting. Interesting. And of course, Paul's an amazing disciple because the main disciples were like, "Well, you're not an apostle. You came late to this game." But what happened? Paul's on the road to Damascus, right? He was killing Christians, holding the coats as they were being killed. He was a Hebrew of all Hebrews, and he finds himself knocked off his horse, and the voice of Jesus speaking, oh, that's a living Jesus, speaks to him, blinds him, and then speaks to a guy on Straight Street and says, "Hey, there's a guy coming, he's blind. You need to, take these scales off his eyes." What? So this Jesus, who had ascended into heaven, given the counselor, right, the Holy Spirit, is speaking to Paul. Do you realize that the belief systems within the church are discouraging you from speaking directly to Jesus? Because it's presenting it in a very loose way as him being a really great historic figure, and that the Bible is what you need to worship. I like the Bible a lot. But if you want to get to know someone, right? The kid moves in down the street and you want to get to know the kid, you don't go to the library to find a book written about him. You go and you talk to him. But if I can convince you that Jesus is dead, he's not alive, and he doesn't speak, then I can have you worship and idolize something else. We do not worship a book. We worship the living Jesus. And that's where life is. He says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So you want to have life and life to its fullest? You want to get past depression, anxiety, the worries, all of these difficulties? You wrestle with him and ask him, hey, how do you see this? And I imagine what things would have been like, because I'm sure that Eve did this in the past, is that when facing a decision to be made in the garden, she could have stopped and said, hang on a second. This doesn't seem right. Let me go ask the one I've walked with in this garden. God's plan all along is that we would have choice and we choose him, because there is this eternal thing. This is super short. And I look at it and I'm like, are we being prepared for this kingdom come? So when they asked Jesus, how do we pray? He said, our Father who art in heaven, holy is your name. There's a holy God in heaven, the creator of all things, right? This is it, who's given authority to Jesus. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So his plan, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The entire purpose statement and plan, the strategic direction of this whole thing, Jesus reveals in that prayer. God's holy, your kingdom come. Well, what's the kingdom? Well, fast forward into the end of Revelation, and it's a kingdom that never passes away. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what is our responsibility in the context of this plan? To go our own way and we got it figured out and we're going to build all of these towers? No. Man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And literally, Jesus, all authority. This is my son. Listen to him. That's what was said from the sky at the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John hear this. This is my son. Listen to him. Are you listening to people telling you that Jesus is dead and he was a historical figure, and that maybe on Easter Sunday he's alive, but that you really need to come under the authority of the Bible and try to figure it out? No. The author and perfecter, the creator of all things, who has all authority, no one comes to the Father except through him, says, I'm right here. You just have to show interest. Are you interested? This isn't about, a religion. It's not about a belief system. It's about interest. And it's something that you can literally try and precise. Why did Jesus tell the story about these seeds that fell on the path? They don't all germinate and grow. They get choked out. You have interest for a little bit and you're like, but the church's focus is on just getting you saved. I know this stuff, believe this stuff, see the evidence of this stuff, and I still go my own way. I'm like, dang it. No, I need to literally live on every word that comes out of the mouth of Jesus. Literally, I'm going to go to you. How do you see this? And that's where I find life. That's where I see miracles. That's where all of these things. And I go, it sounds like you're going to accomplish this plan of going from a garden to a city, that there is this kingdom, that this is a waypoint in this process, clearly. Because I looked at my dad in the casket and I know that this doesn't last forever. But there's no way to get through the Father except through him. And this gate is narrow. Well, what does he ask to do? Follow me. Why? Because I'm a shepherd and the sheep recognize my voice. This whole thing, it's like the Western world of, science and, humanism has basically said, you are God. And what's amazing about this is there's a framework and a context to this. You have the ability to choose. You're very differentiated from the animals. You have opposable thumbs. It's pretty amazing. You can create things. You realize that no value in this world is created without the creative ability that is literally given to you because you are made in the image of God. And what do we find in our world? This whole scarcity model of fighting and killing. Why? We're coveting. We're not getting what we want. What we want. What we want. What we want. Because we think we know best. Jesus says to his Father, hey, remove this cup from me. Yet, not my will, but your will be done. Are you conferring with the Creator who has all authority since the very beginning of time? All things were created for him and by him. And here's the cool thing. Everyone wants to present it as like, all right, you just made this decision. All right, you're in. You got fire insurance from hell. What is life in having it to its fullest? If there's a framework of this, I can plant the seed and I get 1600 to 1. I don't do jack except move, put it in there, and pray for rain, man. The framework of this creation is abundant. And so, what are we doing, whether it be in crypto or wherever, is we're creating these systems of extraction from each other rather than aligning ourselves with the very framework of how it's built. And what comes with aligning yourself with that framework and literally seeing things from Jesus's perspective by asking him, hey, I really want to understand what this looks like. Teach me how to hear from you. What's your intent? What's your interest? And if you go back to Cain and Abel's story, why was Abel's offering accepted? It was accepted because of his intent. What's your intent? Are you interested? Why don't you try them on for size? And that's the thing, I think about evangelism, this idea of, well, you got to get saved, you pray this prayer. I know this stuff. I follow this stuff. I seek to understand it, but I do this because I need the reminder. And I don't hold in the balance, eternity. I hold this moment. And what's amazing about it is there is a currency, which is a peace that transcends all understanding. And when you get a taste of that, that's what Ego Foundation said. I gave up seeking fun and I received joy. What is a peace that transcends all understanding? What is it that happiness that is to tears of serving the God of all creation? Jesus is alive and he speaks. He set this thing up and he modeled it and told you over and over and over and over again. Like my parents said, how many times do I have to tell you before you get it through your thick skull? Well, I appreciate the fact that it was said so many ways in so many different ways. But when you have your eyes open and your ears open to the stuff, you go, wow, it's really simple. So whenever I'm facing these troubles of many kinds, that you have a plan and a purpose for this and that you provide, and that I can go to at any moment. I don't have to go to this, temple at this certain time of day or year. No, I can worship in spirit and in truth. And I can ask a living Jesus, how do you see this? His purpose in creating was that we would rule and reign with him in the fullness of his nature and character. So how are we animating the tools? How are we serving our families? How are we loving our children? Those are animated by us making choices to do things in the nature and character of the God of all creation. Do I do it well? No. Am I seeking to do it well? Am I interested in doing it well? Am I desiring for direction and guidance and purpose? Yes. And what do I get? The greatest currency of all, and that is a peace that transcends all understanding. And it's proof to you that it's real and true. But that's the meaning and purpose of life, and that is to have life and have it to its fullness. If you're somebody who's like, okay, this stuff's crazy, this is the first time I ever heard it this way. There's a guy named Steve Staggs. I have another channel called Crypto Heartbeat, and there was a podcast. I did 37 episodes with Steve Staggs, 74 hours of content. It's in a podcast format, and you can find that on my channel, Crypto Heartbeat, on YouTube. I'd encourage you. I mean, this is where I came to this understanding. And what's amazing is I've read the Bible many times, I've been to church a bunch of times, and to think that this refreshing message is centered around a living and speaking Jesus. And of course, we're in a world right now where everything is being exposed. The supernatural is like being exposed, and we're seeing it. Folks, this has been going on for a long time. And to think that God Himself would send His Son and He would literally be the sum of all fears, He would literally be crucified and killed in the most despicable way, tortured, betrayed by His very friends, and hung up on a cross. And that was the very purpose of Him being here. And to think about that plan, there's nothing you're going through that equals that type of torture and pain. But that's the amazing thing. He took upon Himself all of it. Why? Why? Because that is the reconciliation. The veil is torn from the top down. We have access to the speaking God of all creation, who has authority over all things. He is Melchizedek, the high priest. Jesus, you only get to the Father except through Him. And how do you get it? Because He speaks. Why does He speak? Because He's alive. Don't let anybody else tell you that Jesus is not alive and that He's some historical teacher who lived. No, try Him on for size. He'll show you. Thanks for joining today. I appreciate it. Take care of yourself, folks. We'll catch you next time.